Okay, so I'm going to move us on now to session 2B. And as Mark has alluded to, this is going to be a session that we call Risk for Elephants. And it's basically talking about the insights from the sciences of the brain and the mind about how we handle risk, how it comes across to us, what it evokes in us, how we as humans kind of engage with that concept. So I'm not the expert on this one, but Chris de Meyer is. So Chris, I'm going to hand over to you actually to take people through some of the insights that we kind of use at the CAU.
Okay, thank you, Freya. So Risk for Elephants, what is this all about? So first, when we're talking about climate risk communication, there's of course a lot of knowledge and expertise already out there. There's people who are doing the doing, and I guess that there's a lot of you here today who are sort of at the coal face of trying to make climate risk communication land with different decision makers. Or you might be a communicator, a journalist of some kind. What we're seeing more recently is also lots of empirical studies that test uncertainty and risk representation specifically around climate change. That's a new field that's kind of emerging the last couple of years. But what is not so often understood or known, but widespreadly known, is that there's also a science of communicating risk that goes back quite a few decades earlier. And the types of insights that go into that science of communicating risk is there's a branch that studies the psychology of risk perception. How are people perceiving risk? And some of that research was going on decades before climate change became an actual risk problem. But there's also more and more across neuroscience and psychology, this kind of general information about how brains operate that can help us to understand how messages land, how to make them more effective, and why sometimes the effect that we were hoping our communication would have, why that isn't happening. So we're going to look at 3 insights here that can help you to understand some of the things that go on when you're trying to communicate your climate risk. And we're going to do a little activity in the middle, little breakout room activity in the middle of this presentation. So you best get ready for that particular one. So the first insight of our 3 insights is that our brains aren't engaging in one type of thinking, but at least in 2 different types of thinking. And those are our intuitions and reasoning. And I've put just one word down for each of them to identify how they are different. So our intuitive thinking is automatic, which means that it's going on in the back of our brains all of the time, outside of our conscious awareness, outside of us having to pay any attention to it, it's happening. Our brains are churning away. The other, the word that I put down for reasoning is controlled, meaning that we have to pay attention, we have to exert effort for reasoning to happen, and especially for it to happen well. Some of you may know about Kahneman work, the system 1, system 2, or the process 1, process 2, as it's more accurately called in scientific literature. But my favorite metaphor for understanding how these 2 types of thinking in our brain are working together is to think of our intuitive thinking as a giant elephant and to think of reasoning as a little rider that sits on top of the elephant. Now, the conventional wisdom holds that it's our reasoning, our little rider, the little voice in our heads that is in control or should be in control. But what the science is telling us is that it's the elephant that is calling the shots most of the time. The elephant is determining the direction of travel, and the rider is usually just there to make up the stories of why the elephant is choosing that particular path, that particular direction. So most of the time, the rider is just there to justify and rationalize what our intuitions are giving us, rather than to analyze rationally, to think rationally. Of course, there are exceptions to that, and doing hardcore science is probably one of them. So what's the importance, the relevance of this elephant and rider concept to risk communication? When applied to the psychology of risk perception, people have made a distinction between risk as formal analysis and risk as feeling. And what sits in the middle between those 2 is a risk as intuitive evaluation. So risk as formal analysis, that's what we're doing when we are doing science, when we're thinking long and hard about a particular risk, when we're writing analysis codes or coming up with new algorithms to analyze risk, when we're doing that real nuts and bolts science and analyst work. But most of the time in our daily lives, everyone, including all of us, are using this risk as intuitive evaluation and risk as feeling in how we are determining for ourselves those things that are risky, that we need to pay attention to, that we need to be careful with. And so this risk as intuitive evaluation is that sort of almost automatic response that you get when you see a particular problem presented at you, a particular issue being discussed. And you just get this sense that something's not right here, that something's might be a little bit dangerous. Now, the important, or one of the reasons why this elephant and rider metaphor is so apt is that probably about 95% of what our brains do sits in the elephant. And it's only a few percentage that sits in that rider, that sits in that formal analyzing or formal reasoning thing. And that's really quite counterintuitive because, of course, we feel that being rational, that being clever and smart about things and becoming an expert in something, that really should be sitting on our rider, and that is the stuff that drives expertise. But actually what happens when we're becoming an expert in something is that certain types of knowledge that help us to analyze risk formally become part of our intuitive evaluation. So getting a risk, really grasping a risk, seeing that something is a problem, that is part of our elephant. And we can sort of, as we're becoming an expert in particular problems in society, as we're spending a lot of time thinking about this, that becoming an expert in something such that you immediately can analyze a piece of information, that means that that formal evaluation moves into our elephant and becomes that really intuitive evaluation, the seeing that something is a particular problem. Now, what this doesn't mean, this elephant and rider thing, it's not the distinction, or there's nothing here that necessarily says that a piece of, or a reaction to a risk that comes out of our elephant or that comes out of a rider is necessarily right or wrong, or necessarily rational or irrational. Sometimes the elephant gets a lot of bad press and people think that all of our irrational thinking sits in the elephant. But that's not really the case, because a lot of our good thinking as we're becoming an expert also sits in our elephant. And so it's, for instance, the thing that keeps you alive when you're crossing a busy road. That's a very day-to-day risk situation where the elephant is very useful to us. And of course, as Mark in the example on the banking crisis showed us, you could have banks spending like hundreds and thousands of man hours formally analyzing the risk of their balance sheets and completely missing the actual risk of the real world. So risk as formal analysis can get it incredibly wrong as well. And sometimes risk as intuitive evaluation actually gets it right. The second point is that for people really to get something, including the policymakers that you're engaging with or the decision makers that you're engaging with, it really needs to land with their elephants. You need to connect with their elephants. And we recently tested that. We had a room full of policymakers where we showed them future projections of things like heat waves and droughts and other climate hazards. And we asked them, how does this land with you? And initially, because we had just presented the data, initially they said, these are just numbers on a page. They don't mean anything to us. And then we started to storytell around that. We started to link those numbers to things they already had experience of, a heat wave that had already happened, a drought or a crop failure that had already happened. And by doing that storytelling, we were addressing their elephant and we were making those numbers acquire meaning for them. So connecting with people's elephant is a really important thing for people to get the risk that you're talking about. The final point here is that good, effective risk communication is not the same as scaring people. So there was a lot of soul searching of the climate science community after the recent IPCC report, where they were asking, have we been strong enough in our warnings before? Should we have been starker in the risks that we're painting? And I would say it wasn't an absence of the starkness of the message of how the future might pan out. It was more trying to make, or what was more needed than scaring people was trying to make that connection with the risks that people already naturally understand. So to summarize our elephant and rider metaphor and how it is important for risk communication, for people to really get that climate risk that you want to talk about, try to connect to their elephant. That means, and we'll pick that up in a little bit, is that you need to start with listening first, because if we're immediately going to broadcast, then we will risk not connecting to people's elephant. So by starting to listen first, you can figure out the connection. We'll come back to that a little bit later. And then the final point here is that effective risk communication is not the same as scaring. And to just give one example of why it isn't even useful to scare people, if you would enter a hospital with a dangerous condition, your doctor would come to you and look at you and recognize the risk to your life and might say, well, you're at big risk, you might succumb in the next hour or so, so you need immediate treatment. You don't want your doctor to be scared. You don't want them to start panicking. In fact, if they do, you'll probably ask for a different doctor. So our second insight is Ginger the dog. And what do we mean with this? This is Ginger. So for those of you who don't have a big screen in front of you, this is a Far Side cartoon where the top panel says what we say to dogs, and it's a man berating his dog in long sentences. And the bottom panel says what dogs hear, blah, 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 Ginger, blah, 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 blah. And we use this metaphor in every situation or to describe situations where what we think we are saying is not what other people are hearing. And we often use Ginger, we make Ginger explicit at the start of a conversation where we bring policymakers and scientists or people from other decision backgrounds together with scientists. We often do some Ginger exercises to make us familiar with this idea that we use language differently across different sectors. Now, why does this happen? Why does Ginger appear? It appears specifically in those contexts where we're using abstract words and phrases to describe complex things, which, as Mark introduced us to, happens a lot within the space of climate risk communication. What can happen in that situation is that these abstract words can develop different intuitive understandings, different felt meanings, different elephant understandings with different groups of people. And the reasons are, of course, jargon. Avoiding jargon is always a good thing to do, but it doesn't stop there. Often we have words that we think are fairly simple words and that we have a fairly clear definition for in our own field, but that through practice differences mean something completely different in a different sector. And the third one is value differences. If we have different things that we care about in life, we will also develop different felt meanings about certain words. I'm going to focus on the practice differences here because it's mostly important for when we're thinking about cross-sectoral communication of climate risk. So here's one example, a conservative risk estimate. If you ask a climate scientist what that means, most of them will say, well, that's being fairly rosy and optimistic. It's choosing the side of least drama. But if you ask risk experts, risk analysts in other domains, you will often hear that they look at it as the exact opposite. It is defining the worst possible outcome first. And so it doesn't take much imagination to see that if you're organizing a meeting with people from these different backgrounds, that it might take a while for them to discover that they have these opposing meanings. And we certainly have been in situations like that where we organized workshops and it took a while for people to figure out that they had that different understanding of it. So second example is one that we've been talking about in the previous days a lot, like how do we communicate scientific uncertainty better, and should we do it, and to what degree should we do it? So if you ask a scientist, what does that mean? Then at least one definition of scientific uncertainty, the direct scientific uncertainty as it's often called, is a measure of the spread in the data. But if you ask sort of the ordinary person, non-scientists, what the word uncertainty means, it's being in doubt, not knowing, having, like, not feeling that you have any knowledge. And sometimes that can come even with discomfort and saying, oh, I'm not really comfortable with this state of not knowing. Now, what happens if you put the word scientific in front of that word uncertainty that people interpret through being in doubt or not knowing, is that you're signaling to those audiences that the science doesn't know. And we've certainly seen it happen a lot, where scientists publish a report, the media reports on it, and the comments on social media are, well, that's an organization saying they don't know anything about this particular problem. So that's a very, very big challenge for when we are trying to communicate scientific uncertainty. So with those two examples in mind, those are two that we observe a lot in this space of climate communication. But because you've all been doing the same kind of work, we have, of course, multiple examples of that probably in your own experience and backgrounds. So we're going to hand over to Lucy, or I will hand over to Lucy to set us up for a little exercise on this.
Thanks, Chris. Okay, so we are going to put you into a breakout room with two other people. And what we would like you to do in that breakout room is to talk about your own examples of Ginger the dog moments. So what I want you to do is I want you to think particularly about times when you have been speaking to somebody from another discipline or a different sector, and when there may have been misunderstandings or differences in the definitions that you've been using for particular terms. What we want you to do is we want you not just to think about when that happened, but what happened in that moment. So what was the effect of that Ginger moment on the conversation that you were having or the work that you were trying to do? And also think about how you dealt with that situation. So at that moment, how did you manage it?
All right, welcome back, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you had a fruitful Ginger conversation in your room. Apologies for those of you who ended up in a room by yourself with 90 people. It doesn't seem to work as seamlessly as with fewer people. So let's move on to sort of closing off the Ginger insight. And I'm going to start sharing my screen again. So one of the things that Ginger causes is communication difficulties in the moment, as perhaps you have discussed in your examples. But there are sort of wider effects, or Ginger is often a symptom of other things that are going on within a sector. And when we're looking at a conservative risk estimate, that's a term that people interpret differently in different communities. But what it actually covers is different practices that sit underneath it. And I put it down here on the climate science side, that the focus of error avoidance, that science often is knowledgeable of errors and trying to avoid certain errors, but that within the climate science community, the focus is on avoiding false positives. Whereas in some other risk domains, the focus actually is on avoiding the false negatives, on making sure that nothing slips through the nets. And that practice difference makes the term then have that different language, that different meaning. But of course, the practice differences themselves are very crucial to how you're positioning climate risk in relation to other kinds of risks. And there's one example that when I was thinking about is like, what's a good example of a risk community trying to avoid the false negatives? I thought of the bridge in London, Hammersmith Bridge, which was recently closed because they had discovered some cracks in the bridge. And at first it was closed for traffic only, but then it was also closed for pedestrians and cyclists. And the reasoning behind it was that the worst case that could happen with that bridge, that it would collapse. And the worst case would even be that it collapsed at the moment that a school of 6-year-old children is crossing the bridge. So someone had asked that question, done that reasoning, and said, no matter how much or how little uncertainty there is about that specific problem, the worst case is too bad here, and we need to do something. We need to take a drastic step here. So that's one example of avoiding false negatives that led to a very clear decision outcome that you don't usually have available in climate, because there is an overemphasis on avoiding the false positives. Now, what about communicating uncertainty? This other example that we were talking about, and the concept of communicating uncertainty came back throughout the first 2 days, and also will come back later this afternoon. So there are two options here. The first one is to try and bridge that gap, to really try to get across that you're not just talking about not knowing, about being in doubt, but that there is knowledge in the fact that there is a range of outcomes possible. And there are certainly specific decision contexts where that will be very important. And we will see some examples of that later in the session today. But the other option could be, and we're not doing that very well at the moment, or not at all almost, is to work with the end users of your research to collapse the uncertainty to certain values that are important for decision making. So rather than focusing on trying to find better ways to communicate the uncertainty, you could try to work together with the decision maker to figure out what are the values of real importance to decision making, and those are the values that you could communicate out. That is something that we need to figure out how to do better. We don't do it well at the moment. And it has the advantage that we would be supporting decision making much more better than if we just focus on finding better ways of communicating the uncertainty. If we keep on doing that, what will happen is that the people that we work most closely with, the ones that are in the value chain that Mark showed earlier, most closely related to our work, they will become accustomed to our definitions. They will make it part of their elephants, our definitions of uncertainty, but then they have a communication problem of their own, because the people that they need to communicate downstream to will be the ones that then need to be dealing with the difference in definitions that we have across those terms. So the take-home messages here is that what we think we are saying is often not what people are hearing. You can't define a way ginger really, because it sits in our elephant. It's very much part of ourselves and who we are. But what we can do is surface ginger problems early on and then find language that allows you to communicate around it. So rather than continuing to use that term, conservative risk estimate, you can be explicit in describing what it is that you mean when you're giving a risk estimate. And then the third one is adapt your practices to your target audience, which may be, for instance, that giving up on the need to communicate uncertainty and rather trying to find out what values really matter to them. So the third insight, which I'm going to touch only very briefly, is the pyramid of polarization. And what this captures is the idea of how our brains go from having only very weak opinions about something to having very strong opinions about something. What happens is that if we don't have a strong idea or a strong mindset about something in particular, like climate change or climate risk, or how we will make a certain decision in life, it's like being at the top of a pyramid. Once your mind goes like, you know, I've been thinking about this problem for a while, I think I need to go with this decision. It's like taking a step off on one side of the pyramid. And what happens in our brains is that we start self-justifying. We start persuading ourselves that we're making the right decision. That makes our next action in the same direction much more likely. You now start to talk to friends and family about this, so you start to communicate professionally about this. And the more you take these actions down the sides of the pyramid, the more you convince yourself that you're making the right decision. What happens is that someone who accidentally, almost accidentally or serendipitously stepped off on the other side of the pyramid goes down their side of the pyramid and becomes very convinced, very certain that they are making the right decision as well. So it helps us to understand how polarization emerges in a domain of climate change. Now, until a few years ago, this would have been most appropriate to describe the distinction between the climate skeptics and the climate believers, for lack of a better word. But in the last few years, something else is happening. As the societal concern about climate change is increasing, more and more people are stepping off sides of the pyramid with respect to what we need to do about climate change. And that leads to a fragmentation of what people see as meaningful action on climate change. So there's all of these fault lines that are appearing in society about what we should do to tackle climate change. And here are just a few of them. There's one in particular that's important for communication about climate change, which is that perennial debate that you can run into on Twitter of whether we should use fear messaging or hope messaging around climate change. Our answer is you shouldn't use neither. You should tell stories of action to bypass that particular distinction. But there is at the moment very strong fragmentation and polarization across different groups of people who think that we should be focusing on fear versus hope. Now, why is this important for climate risk communication? Because the higher the perceived risk of climate change, the more that fragmentation can keep on happening. And that means that risk information in itself is not going to be enough to lead to clear policy and action. We will need to do other things in addition to communicate the risk. And that's about how you communicate with your end users to help you to understand how to turn risk information into action information. We're going to have a session on that in a little bit. The second point is that if you find yourself in one of those heated debates, if you are part of that yourself, or you see some other people battling it out with each other, then take a step back from that, take a step away from that pyramid, and understand that there is a need for plurality and for this idea of alignment, this idea that we will need multiple pathways to that allow us parallel solutions to climate change to being pursued altogether. Okay, so that's it on the insights. I'm going to hand over to Freya to take us forward.
Brilliant, thank you, Chris. It was really great to hear about those 3 insights there. And I know that you've actually written about more insights than just this. And so just to let all the participants know that there'll be loads more information and another couple of resources for you to go to when we get to section 5A today, and that's when we'll show you what's in the goodie bag. Now at this point we're running a little bit behind, so we're going to give you a 10-minute break and we're going to restart at 13:40, so that's 20 minutes to the hour wherever you are. So if you could be back promptly for then, we will start the next session. And thank you, Chris.